It is November 10th of 1444, and beneath the fortress of Varna, two armies, composed of some of the best warriors from the Christian and Islamic worlds, are arrayed against one another. The victor of the battle to come would not only get the spoils of war, but also total victory over their foe after a year-long military struggle. Not known by its combatants at the time, the following engagement was to be the last crusade of its kind in European history. All of a sudden, the war horns of the two armies echoed throughout the plain below, and great waves of dust clouds erupted from the earth. The Battle of Vana had just begun. This video is made available for free thanks to our YouTube members and patrons. We fund our free content through our program of exclusive videos made for our members and patrons, who get 2 documentaries per week not available to the public. Join their ranks and watch the series on the Albigensian Crusade, Fall of Sparta, First Punic War, Italian Reunification Wars, History of Prussia, Biography of Sulla, Russo-Japanese War, Reconquista, Persian Wars and War of Spanish Succession, and much more. All this is made for and with generous donations from our backers. So if you're enjoying our content and want to see more and support the cause of history, consider becoming a YouTube member or patron. Join their ranks via the link in the description and pinned comment to learn our schedule, get early access to all videos, voting rights on future videos, and much more. You will be able to watch more than 100 exclusive videos today. Thanks for supporting us. With the signing of the Peace of Szeged during the summer of 1444, many political actors in the Ottoman capital thought the costly and bloody Hungarian conflict of the last year had finally concluded. A steady peace had fallen upon the Balkans, as an independent and neutral buffer state in the form of Serbia had been re-established, and prisoner swaps between Edirne and Buda took place. A 10-year truce had also been established between the two sides, which gave into the illusion that the wars of the last few years had indeed concluded for good. Likewise, peace with the Karamanids was secured in August, for the price of handing over the border towns of Akshehir and Beyshehir back to the Bay of Konya. Peace in the west and east had been secured. Now that he was presiding over a peacetime government, Sultan Murad II began taking steps to ensure the future of his imperial dynasty and sultanate. The last 12 months had been personally tragic and militarily disastrous for the Sultan of the Ottomans. In addition to the major military defeats of 1443 and the humiliating peace settlement of 1444, he had also lost his beloved son and heir apparent Shehzada Alaeddin in a horse riding accident in Anatolia. While his favourite son was being buried in Bursa, Murad called for his sole living son, Shehzada Mehmed, to depart from the province of Amasya, where he was governor, and go to the Ottoman capital at once. With a steady peace in Europe secured, the Ottoman Sultan wished to abdicate his throne to his 12-year-old son and retire from public life. The wars and politicking of the last 23 years had left Murad mentally exhausted. As a result, he wanted to indulge himself in philosophy and spiritualism at his garden palace in Manisa, away from the scheming halls of Edirne. Many in the Ottoman court initially frowned upon the Sultan's abdication plans, as his successor was a relatively inexperienced member of the House of Osman. It was only after some political persuasion by Murad, on the basis of securing a peaceful transition of power for the Sultanate, that the plan was finalized. Many still remembered the chaotic ascensions of Mehmed I and Murad II, and the civil wars that engulfed the first years of their reigns. With the constant threat of Orhan Çelebi from Constantinople always being ever present, Ottoman statesmen and the religious ulema respected their sultan's wishes to retire. By late August 1444, Shehzada Mehmed had arrived in the Ottoman capital and was proclaimed Sultan as Mehmed II, while his father travelled off to Manisa. With the majority of the Ottoman army in Anatolia and a boy sultan now residing in Edirne, the push for another crusade had become incredibly popular within Władysław's court in Buda. The Polish-Hungarian monarch had already pledged to continue his war against the Muslims even during the peace talks of the summer, but the surprising news of Murad II's sudden retirement and a child now occupying the Ottoman throne had given more life to the young king's ambitions. more good news came at the end of August, when a combined naval fleet from the Papacy, Venice and Burgundy began their promised joint blockade of the Dardanelles and Bosporus Straits. While the Ottoman navy stationed at Gallipoli was perplexed about whether or not an official war had broken out, even more good news arrived for Władysław. During the first weeks of fall, the Ottoman capital of Edirne was engulfed in a destructive fire that saw the destruction of over 2,000 homes and buildings, a sign interpreted by the Crusaders as God's approval for the upcoming military campaign. With the Ottomans already distracted by various internal issues, the ball was in the court of Buda to open the first salvos in the upcoming war. Having already mustered men and materials in the summer, the Crusader host of 20,000, under Hunyadi and Władysław, crossed the Danube at the border town of Osowa into Ottoman Bulgaria on the 18th of September, much to the shock and horror of Edirne. Although the following military expedition was a crusade on paper, it did not receive military or fiscal help from the other major powers of Europe, such as France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, Castile and Aragon. Like the long campaign from a year prior, the expedition was again to be a mainly Polish-Hungarian endeavour. Attempts to incite Christian revolts in Ottoman lands and to ally with independent Balkan leaders in the region against Mehmed had also failed to bring any results for Władysław. The already ongoing Albanian revolt, led by Skanderbeg, had no means to march to the aid of the Crusaders while fighting an insurgency in their country, while Vlad II of Wallachia wished to keep his country far from the war to come. Only a light cavalry force of around a few thousand, led by the latter ruler's son, the formerly crowned Mircea II, was reluctantly given for the Crusader cause. Even Juraj Branković of Serbia, having already regained his lands during the peace talks of the summer, stayed neutral in the crusade to come, and paradoxically warned Hunyadi in person that the expedition was doomed to fail. The little help that did come from the local region had also failed to take root, such as John VIII's release of Orhan Çelebi into the Balkans, which failed to gather enough followers to incite a new Ottoman civil war. In spite of these developments, the military campaign continued on, as morale was high. Like with the long campaign the year prior, the main goal of the new crusade was to re-establish a number of Christian buffer states in the Balkans, while at the same time coming to the aid of Constantinople. After spending 4 days crossing the Danube, the Crusader army retraced the steps of King Sigismund's fabled crusade of 48 years past by marching eastwards, hugging the southern bank of the Danube. The Ottoman towns of Vidin and Oryahovo were captured and sacked in short sieges, and again their Turkish garrisons and inhabitants were slain. On the 20th of October, the fortress town of Nicopolis also fell to the Crusaders, thus avenging the events of 1396. Believing that the bulk of the Ottoman army was stranded in Anatolia due to the blockade, the Crusaders began their forced march on Edirne by following the Osam River south in order to pass through the Shipka Pass. Unbeknownst to them, the former Sultan Murad and his grand host were merely a week's march south. A month prior, the initial Crusader invasion had caused a mass general panic in Edirne, as many thought Hunyadi was weeks away from sacking what was left of their burnt-down city. As a makeshift moat was being constructed around the Ottoman capital, Mehmed II's advisors sent urgent letters to an obstinate Murad who was in Manisa, but to no avail. The former sultan insisted that he had abdicated the throne, and that now the current crisis was for his son to solve. Furious at his father, Mehmed wrote a personal letter stating to him that, "If imperial power and the sultanate belong to you, you are obliged to defend them against the enemy. Otherwise, if these things now belong to me, then it is necessary to obey the sultan and take control of the army." Accepting his son's plea for help, Murad left his secluded garden palace and began gathering the army of Anatolia for war. After a few days, the army was readied, and the march toward Europe began in earnest. Knowing that a quite significant Crusader navy blockaded the straits, the former Ottoman Sultan decided to take his chances and cross into Europe across the more lightly blockaded Bosphorus Strait to the north. With the help of Grand Vizier Jandeli Halil Pasha the Younger, the Ottoman Anatolian army crossed into Europe under the protection of cannon fire from the Anadolu Hisarı, much to the dismay of the Crusaders. However, the crossing wouldn't have been possible in the first place without the transport ships deployed by the Genoese, as they were fearful of potential Venetian gains from the Crusade, and so supported Aderna's war effort. The unexpected strait crossing was to be a turning point in the Crusade, as Aderna now had a proper army and a military leader capable of facing head-on the White Knight of Transylvania. Meanwhile, in Bulgaria, the unaware Crusaders had begun their siege of Tarnovo, the former seat of the old Bulgarian Empire. However, the following siege of the town was to be disastrous for the Crusaders, as Ottoman sallying out parties seized and destroyed many of their supply wagons. Low on supplies, Hunyadi ordered the army to head east to the Black Sea coast, where the Crusader fleet could resupply them, thus temporarily abandoning the march towards Aderna. Along the long and fraught journey, the Ottoman towns of Shumen, Madara and Provadia were burned to the ground. By the first week of November, the army had reached the Ottoman coastal fortress of Varna and captured it after a quick siege. It was also during this period that the shocking news of Murad's arrival into Europe reached the Crusader camp. Mehmed II and his father had spent the better part of the last month mustering a sizable Ottoman army at Aderna and Stara Zagora. Like during the long campaign, Murad declared a jihad against the invaders as a means to muster men into the ranks of the army on short notice. By the first week of November, the army was readied for war. Leaving the young Ottoman Sultan in the care of the Grand Vizier back in the capital, Murad marched out of the city at the head of a 40,000-strong army. For the next week, the Muslim army followed the main road up to Yambol and continued up to Idos. Wanting to cut the Crusaders off from the west, the former Ottoman Sultan crossed the Kamchia River on November 7th and entered Provadia the next day. By the 9th of November, Transylvanian scouts of John Hunyadi had spotted Murad's grand host marching in from the west towards Varna. Being cornered with the sea to their backs and the supply fleet nowhere to be seen, the Crusader Council decided to engage the Ottoman army the following morning. In the War Council, Hunyadi declared, "To escape is impossible, to surrender is unthinkable. Let us fight with bravery and honor our arms." The climactic battle that would determine the fate of the entire military campaign seemed to be on the horizon, and its location was to be at Varna. On the morning of November 10th, both the armies of Murad and Władysław III assembled on a plain overlooking the fortress of Varna. To the east lay the Black Sea, while Lake Varna and the forested Franga Plateau lay to the south and north respectively. The former Ottoman Sultan deployed his men in a crescent formation across the entire mouth of the plain, stretching for over 5 miles. Anatolian Beylerbey Karaca Pasha led the right wing of the army, alongside the Anatolian Tamali Sepahis, while Rumelian Beylerbey Shahabeddin Pasha led the left wing of the army alongside the Balkan Tamali Sepahis. Meanwhile, the former Ottoman Sultan himself commanded the center alongside his heavy Kapikulu Sipahi cavalry, elite Janissary infantry, and a small unit of artillery. In the vanguard of the entire army were the light Azab infantry, armed with maces, bows, and axes. In the center of the army line, they were protected by a trench and a wall of iron palisades. Lastly, a unit of light Akunjo cavalry was stationed on the far left, on the Franga Plateau. The Crusader army was half the size of the Ottoman host, numbering around 20,000 men. However, like in the previous battles of Kosovo and Nicopolis, the Christian army made up for its inferior numbers with its superior armor. John Hunyadi's brother-in-law, Michael Selagi, led the left wing, which consisted of Transylvanian heavy knights and light hussar cavalry. Many in this flank were hardened veterans of the long campaign and other military campaigns against Aderna, and so had prior experience in fighting against the Ottomans. King Władysław III and John Hunyadi commanded the center, which consisted of the king's personal mounted bandarium, heavy mounted knights from Hungary and Poland, and mercenary infantry from Germany. Conversely, Bishop John de Dominus of Oradea led the Crusader right wing, which consisted of heavy infantry from Hungary and light infantry and cavalry from Bosnia and Croatia. They were joined by a small group of heavy Western knights, led by Cardinal Julian Cesarini, and Wallachian light cavalry led by Prince Mircea, stationed in the rear. Lastly, behind the entire Crusader army was a line of fortified war wagons, crewed by Czech mercenaries armed with crossbows and small artillery pieces. The battle began with a general charge of the left flanks of both armies. Starting on the Hungarian left, Michael Szilágyi led his Transylvanian heavy knights and light hussar cavalry into the lightly armoured ranks of the Ottoman Anatolian army. The following melee was to be one-sided, as the Anatolian Azabs and Sepahis were overwhelmed by some of the best warriors Christendom had to offer. As war trumpets littered the battlefield, the Wallachian cavalry under Mircea entered the fray, protecting Szilágyi's right flank from an Ottoman counterattack from the centre. With the Azab light infantry unable to penetrate the heavy armour of the Crusader knights, and now being cut down by the highly mobile hussar cavalry, the entire Ottoman right flank began to break into a total rout. Wanting to encourage his fellow men during the heat of the battle and spurred on to not retreat in the face of great odds, Karaca Pasha and his personal bodyguard charged into the Crusader advance, but to no avail. In only a matter of moments, the Anatolian Beyler Bey was cut to pieces, and as a result, the shattered remains of the Ottoman right fled the battlefield. The Crusaders decisively won the first phase of the battle, but elsewhere the Battle of Vana was still dragging on. On the Ottoman left, the initial charge of Shehabeddin Pasha and his Akunja cavalry from the Franga Plateau had seen tremendous success. The Ottoman offensive on the Crusader right had resulted in John de Dominus's forces being pushed back to the war wagons in a total rout. Even a cavalry charge led by John Hunyadi himself was driven back as the most experienced soldiers in the Ottoman provincial army slashed their way through the ranks of the Crusader right. It was during this retreat that an arrow partially pierced the helmet of the Transylvanian magnate as he fled to safety. Having captured 4 Crusader banners in the initial advance, the Ottoman left continued pushing forward in the direction of the Black Sea in order to finish off the Crusader right. However, the pursuing advance was soon to be halted by the immense gunfire of the war wagons in the Crusaders' rear, in addition to a heroic last stand led by Cesarini and his Western volunteers. It was also during this period in the battle that reinforcements from the Crusader left and centre began trickling down to aid the shattered but still standing Crusader right flank, much to the trepidation of Murad. Even the Polish-Hungarian king and his personal bodyguard had entered the fray of battle, thus ensuring the stabilization of the Crusader right. Witnessing that his foe now outnumbered him, Shehabeddin Pasha began regrouping his exhausted forces back to the mouth of the plain and the Franga Plateau. Nevertheless, almost half of the forces of the Rumelian Beyler Bey were lost or routed in the retreat. Despite the fact that the struggle had been ongoing for only several hours, thousands of soldiers on both sides and their steeds littered the plain overlooking Varna. The stench of bloodied corpses, gunpowder and sweat, in addition to the groans of the wounded, echoed across the battlefield. Much of the Ottoman army had either fled the field or were killed in battle, while the exhausted Crusader army had also sustained heavy casualties of their own. As a result of the bloody toll suffered in the struggle for Varna and the hot afternoon sun now shining above the battlefield, a pause in the fighting took place between the two armies. With the exception of the Wallachians, who were plundering the former camp of Karaca Bey, the bloodied and jumbled Crusader army now began regrouping its forces for a final assault on the Ottoman centre. During this pause, John Hunyadi, Władysław III, and the rest of the Crusader leadership met behind the protection of the war wagons to discuss their next moves. The White Knight of Transylvania urged his monarch to regroup and rest the army while waiting for Murad's exhausted host to either make a desperate attack on their positions or withdraw from the battlefield. In contrast, the young king's advisors instead urged their monarch to take the fight to the former Ottoman Sultan, as much of the enemy army had already been dispersed. What followed was a furious power struggle between the Polish-Hungarian nobility and the Transylvanian nobility led by Hunyadi over the approval of their monarch. At the end of the meeting, the 20-year-old Władysław had fallen victim to his own vanity and thus sided with the former group. The king drew his sword and led a group of around 500 heavy-mounted knights in a charge directed to the Ottoman centre. As Hunyadi had predicted, the former Ottoman Sultan was in the process of withdrawing from the battlefield. but upon seeing the enemy king's royal standards charging towards him, he prepared for a final engagement. Almost immediately, Władysław and his mounted knights were bogged down in the iron palisades protecting the Ottoman centre, in which many succumbed to gunfire and arrows while trying to breach the fortifications. After a short and bloody struggle, a path was opened up over the fortifications, and the Crusader knights charged into a group of entrenched Azabs and elite Janissaries. Many on both sides were slain in the gruesome hand-to-hand combat. Seeing the Ottoman royal tent off in the distance during the heat of battle, Władysław and his personal guard broke off from the main group of knights and began their charge toward Murad. However, it was during this charge that a member of Murad's personal Sulek guard, a man by the name of Kochanezir, rose to the occasion and knocked the Polish-Hungarian king off his steed with his battle axe. Laying helpless and dazed on the ground, Władysław gasped his last breath as the guardsman lopped his head off before putting it on top of a pike. Hunyadi, along with his Transylvanian knights, were the first to hear of the king's death, as they had been close behind his fateful final charge. The Transylvanian magnate waged a considerable struggle to retrieve his monarch's corpse all throughout the evening into sunset, but to no avail. Unable to break through the Janissaries, Hunyadi took his portion of the Crusader army and began his retreat up north through the Frenga plateau under the cover of night. Many were killed during the hectic retreat, as Ottoman Akinci horsemen trapped many lost Crusaders in the numerous dark ravines of the plateau. By the following morning, Murad had regrouped his remaining forces with Shahabedin Pasha's left flank and began spreading the surprising news of Władysław's death for all to hear. This resulted in many Ottoman units that had been routed the previous day returning to the battlefield, as morale in the Muslim camp once again went up. Meanwhile, the remaining Crusader army at Varna had camped overnight behind their war wagons, believing they had won a great victory for Christendom, not knowing the disaster that befell their valiant leader. It wasn't until the reformed Ottoman army had marched up to their camp and showcased the severed head of Władysław on a pike that any Crusader notion of victory over the Turks disappeared. The second struggle for Varna lasted until the evening, when the remaining demoralized and leaderless Crusader troops broke under the weight of a full-on Ottoman assault. While Mircea and Michael Szilágyi barely fled the battlefield with their lives, John de Dominus of Oradea, Cardinal Julian Cesarini, and the rest of the Christian army perished in the heat of battle. And with that, the Battle of Vana was over. The Battle of Vana had resulted in a Pyrrhic victory for the Ottoman Sultanate. Although the war between Edirne and Buda persisted for another half-decade, the victory at Varna ensured Ottoman presence in the Balkans for centuries to come. The Crusade of Varna was the last time Christian powers made a major effort to expel the Ottoman Turks from Europe under papal backing. The battle had also politically destabilized Hungary and Poland, as both nations were engulfed in respective succession crises. Only time would tell if the Ottomans under the young Mehmed II could capitalize on their victory over Hungary and take the fight to Buda. In the next episode of our series on the early history of the Ottomans, we will look at the continuing wars between Edirne and Buda in the years after the Battle of Varna, in addition to a certain rebelling Albanian lord in the form of Skanderbeg. To ensure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Recently, we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member-exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video. To watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.